First of all, I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight. I was beginning to think that you must have thought there was going to be someone else here tonight besides myself. I didn't count on having quite such a crowd. I'm really glad to see that we got a lot of children here tonight. You know, I really am. You know, this exhibit here, Lincoln, the Constitution, and the Civil War, and now those are three things that you can have quite a conversation at the restaurant with a fellow you don't even know, you know. So, but I guess the best place for me to start this story is at the beginning. And since the best place is there, here's how it goes. I was born in Kentucky, February the 12th, 1809, in a one-room dirt floor log cabin in Hardin County, Kentucky. My papa's name was Tom Lincoln. My mama was Nancy Lincoln. I had an older sister named Sarah. And I had a little brother named Thomas Jr., but he died when he was just a baby. Now my family left Kentucky and we moved to Indiana about the time that territory became a state. I was just barely 7 years old, and it was there in Indiana that 2 years later my beautiful mother died. She died of what we call the milk sickness. Now that was an illness that was caused because my mother drank poison milk from cows that had eaten a poisonous plant. We lost hundreds of people because they drank poison milk. We buried my mama just behind our house on this little hill, all surrounded with trees and flowers. But I tell you, I missed her. Oh, I missed her. I'll get your question later. Now, my sister, oh, she tried to take care of me and Papa as best she could, but my sister was only 11 years old. Papa knew we had to have a mother. So a year later, he married again. This time, he married a widow woman. Her name was Sarah Bush Johnston, and I called her my Mammy Sari. Oh, friends, I tell you this, my stepmother, my Mammy Sari, was the finest lady I've ever known in my entire life. She treated me just like I was her very own little boy. Even though she brought 3 children with her, she had 2 girls, Elizabeth and Matilda, and she had a boy named Jonathan. Now, folks, the first thing that happened, when my stepmother got to that farm, she got off the wagon, she came inside our little cabin, she looked down and she saw it still had a dirt floor in there. She looked at my papa and she said, "Tom Lincoln, I ain't living in no house that's got dirt on the floor." So Papa put down a nice wooden floor. Then she looked at the walls and the ceiling. She turned to my papa and she said, "Tom Lincoln, I ain't living in no house that don't have paint on the walls and the ceiling painted." So Papa painted the walls and the ceiling snow white. Now, boys and men, have you ever had a real good idea that turned out not to be a good idea? One time I had this great idea. My stepmother was out in our yard. She was washing her clothes in a big bucket full of water, you know, and when the water got dirty, she poured it out in the yard and made these big mud puddles. Well, this was my great idea. I got my little stepbrother, Jonathan. Come up here and help me. Come here, come here, come here. Take that hat off me. Yeah, come on, put that down here. Now, what's your name again?
Jack.
That's right, Jack. Well, you're going to be Jonathan. Now, you see, we always went barefoot in them days unless it was snowing outside, so this was my brilliant plan. I took my little barefooted stepbrother, I took him out in the yard, and I stood him down in that mud puddle. And I squished him all around. He got mud all over his feet, and in between his toes, and all up under his toenails. And then, shh, I picked him up. I took him in our house, and I stuck his muddy feet up against the wall. I let him walk up the wall, across the ceiling, and down the wall. I tell you, when my Mammy Sari came in the house, and she saw them muddy footprints up on the ceiling, she said, "How can anybody walk up there?" And me and Jonathan, we just laughed and we laughed. And then my stepmother looked at me. She said, "Abraham, I believe you had something to do with that." I said, "I sure did, Mammy. Don't you think it was funny?" Now, she said it was really funny. Really funny. Then she gave me and Jonathan 2 big brushes and a bucket of water. Guess who had to clean that mud up? Give him a hand, will you? You know, friends, my stepmother, she brought a lot of things into that cabin when she moved in with us, but the best thing she brought into that little log home was a whole lot of love. We were a family again. We were happy again. I had a mother again. Now, there's one thing we didn't have: Schools were very few and far between in Indiana in those days. Well, folks, I don't guess that the sum total of my education amounts to more than 1 full year. I went to school by the littles. I went a little when I was 7. I went a little when I was 9. And I went a little when I was 10. And that was it. That was all of my formal education. But my papa was always a wandering man. And we left Indiana and we moved to Indiana, left Indiana, moved to Illinois about the time of my 21st year. And boys, in those days, you stayed at home with your mama and papa till you were 21 years old. And if you made any money on your own, you gave all of that money to your papa. So when we got to Illinois, I helped Papa cut enough logs to build a house, split enough rails to build a fence, helped him put in the first crop, and I said goodbye. Struck out on my own, and landed in the little village of New Salem, Illinois. Oh, folks, I tell you, I just landed there by accident. You know, I was taking a flatboat down the Sangamon River, and we got up to the mill dam, and the boat got hung on the dam there, you see. It wouldn't go over, you know. And everybody was screaming and hollering because we had all these hogs on there, and they'd make a lot of noise, you know. Everybody wanted to see what was going to happen. Well, I just took all the stuff from one end of the boat and moved it to the other, and I borrowed an auger. Any of you know what an auger is there? Like a big drill bit, you know. And I drilled me a big hole in the front end of that boat. Well, when we got the cargo shifted, she went up, and all the water run out. We plugged up the hole, and then we got it off. I went down to New Orleans. I have to admit, that first trip to New Orleans had its adventures. Not only did we get stuck on the mill dam, but the young man who went with me, we had tied up our boat one night somewhere down south of where Memphis is, you know. And about midnight, 7 runaway slaves boarded our vessel. I assume with the intention of killing us and relieving us of our goods. A melee ensued, and after a while, Alan Gentry and myself had got our boarders off of our ship. I carried a scar for the rest of my life, though. We cut loose and went on down to New Orleans. I saw slaves in New Orleans. As a matter of fact, friends, I had seen slaves even when I was a child in Kentucky. I mean, the main road at our Knob Creek farm, it was the main road from Louisville to Nashville. You know, I'd seen slaves going down the road. I had never actually seen a slave auction, and I didn't even see that my first trip to Illinois, down there to New Orleans. Well, I came back and I settled in New Salem, Illinois, and I got me a job as a clerk and part owner in a little grocery store. But without an education and with no head for arithmetic, it didn't take long and the store went broke. So I had to look elsewhere. I was a surveyor. I was a postmaster. Oh, I was a captain in the Black Hawk Indian War, and I have to tell you about that, see, Chief Black Hawk and his warriors had come across the river, and they had massacred a great number of white settlers. Now, we whites, we had broken the treaty, but that didn't make any difference. We were going to make the Indians pay for it. So me and my boys, we jumped on our horses, and we chased wild Indians all over the country for more than 3 months. And in 3 months, I never saw but one live Indian. And that was an old warrior who I saved from being hanged by my own men. You know, I was in a lot of bloody battles during the Black Hawk Indian War, but none of them with Indians. My battles were all with mosquitoes and chiggers and so forth. I went into that war a captain. I came out 3 months later a private. Now, wait a minute. It doesn't mean that I wasn't a good leader. I reckon I was a pretty good leader, but me and the boys in New Salem had signed up to fight Indians for 30 days. After 30 days, they all had wives and sweethearts to go home to, you know, so they went back home. I was having the time of my life, you know, so I signed up with another group, and they made me a corporal. After that 30 days, they all went home. Well, I signed up with another group, and as high as I could get was private there, you know. They mustered me out of the militia on a Saturday afternoon in the state of Wisconsin. And the next day, somebody stole my horse. And I walked all the way from Wisconsin to New Salem, Illinois. And I have never felt the same about walking to Wisconsin since. But it was at New Salem, Illinois that I first got involved in politics. I was elected to the first of 4 terms in the state legislature, and I began to study the law. In 1837, they gave me a license to practice the law. Now understand, I didn't have to pass the bar. I didn't have to go to college. All I had to do was read the law. And I read the law for 2 years. And I got a license because I had 4 practicing attorneys and a sitting judge to sign an affidavit that said I was a man of good moral character and had a working knowledge of the law. As soon as I got that license, I moved to Springfield, Illinois. Got a job with another lawyer, a fellow named John Stewart. But ladies, it was in Springfield, Illinois that I first met, fell in love with, and got married to a beautiful young Kentucky girl named Mary Todd. Oh, I tell you, I had been worshiping Mary Todd from afar. Now, fellas, you got to remember, back in those days, if you liked a gal, but you was too chicken to say anything to her, well, you worshiped her from afar. Well, I worshiped Mary for quite a while, you know, and one night they had a party at her sister's house. I shined up my shoes, I put on my best coat, and I walked right straight up to her, and I said, Miss Todd, ma'am, Miss Todd, ma'am, my name's Abraham Lincoln, and, well, golly, ma'am, I'd like to dance with you in the worstest way. So we started to dance, and how we danced. Gentlemen, have to confess, it was the most romantic evening of my entire life. I twirled her all over the dance floor. And after I stepped on her toes about 25 times, she stopped me. She looked up and she said, you know, Mr. Lincoln, you're right. You do dance in the worst way. We were married a short time later, and we never danced again. Now, life in Springfield, though, was just fine. I bought the only home that I would ever own. My law practice grew, and I continued to dabble in politics, while once they made me a United States congressman. But the only thing I managed to do in Congress was make an enemy out of President James K. Polk of Tennessee. Ladies and gentlemen, it is never a good idea for a freshman congressman to call the President of the United States a liar. But he was. He was. He said that Mexico had invaded the United States, and that's why we went to war with them. And I said, all right, then you show me. You show me the exact spot where the first drop of American blood was spilled. It wasn't spilled on American soil, it was spilled in Mexico. Mexico didn't invade us, we invaded her. Why? We wanted all that land she had, and we got it too. I was not a candidate for re-election, though, so I went back to Springfield and just threw myself into my law practice. Now, my wife and I had 4 boys, you know, Robert, Edward, William, and Thomas, and shortly after I came back from my 1 term in Congress, our little Eddie, he died of a fever when he was barely 4 years old. I just put all thought of politics behind me, and I just threw myself into my law practice. And at the same time, I still wanted to be in politics, but I just thought my political career is over, you know. The party that I was a Whig, you know, for 25 years. I'd have stayed a Whig if the Whigs hadn't Whigged out, you know. But they did, and they formed this new party, this Republican Party, and then so I just hitched my rope to their wagon, and I became a Republican, you know. But ladies and gentlemen, 4 years after my little Eddie died, I was aroused to politics as never before by the repeal of the Missouri Compromise and the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, that was a new law that, among other things, was going to make slavery legal in our new states and territories as well as the old. I was determined to stop it if I could. So by 1858, I was running for the United States Senate. I gave my first speech in the Senate race in the State House in Springfield, and a speech that went in part something like this. We are now far into the 5th year since a policy was initiated with the avowed object and confident promise of putting an end to slavery agitation. But under the operation of that policy, that agitation has not only not ceased, it is constantly augmented. In my opinion, it will not cease until a crisis shall have been reached and passed. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I do not believe that this government can permanently endure half slave and half free. Now, I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect that it shall cease to be divided. It will be one thing or the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it and place it where the public mind can rest in the belief that it is in the course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates shall push it forward till it shall become lawful in the new states as well as the old, north as well as south. My opponent for the Senate race was Stephen Arnold Douglas. Now, Steve Douglas was this little short, fat-headed, loudmouth Democrat. I'm sorry, he was. Everybody called him the Little Giant. Well, the Little Giant and I participated in a series of 7 debates. And the main topics of these debates, no matter how Mr. Douglas tried to cover it up, friends, it was never about popular sovereignty. No, it was always about slaves and slavery. You see, Douglas thought that it was perfectly acceptable for one human being to buy and sell another human being just because the color of their skin was different. Now, friends, I thought that was wrong. So it was a long and bitter campaign. And I tell you this, Douglas said some mighty harsh things about me. One time he told a whole crowd of people that I was two-faced. Two-faced. Now, young lady, I'll ask you the same thing I asked that Little Giant. Now, if I really was a man who had 2 faces, you think I'd come out here tonight and look like this? Well, this reminds me of another story altogether real quick. I was in the store in Springfield one day, and old Widow Jones come in the front door, and she saw me back in the corner. She stared for the longest time, you know, and finally she said, "Well, my, Abraham Lincoln. Abe, I believe you are the ugliest human being I've ever seen." And I told her, I said, "Well, now, Miss Jones, I'm really sorry that you feel that way, but, you know, I can't help that." She looked at me and she said, "What you mean you can't help it?" "Well, boy, you could have stayed in your house. I wouldn't have had to look at you at all." But all teasing aside, when that race for the United States Senate was over and all the ballots were counted, I lost. A fellow asked me, he said, "How do you feel about losing the Senate race?" I said, "Well, I'm kind of like the boy that stubbed his toe. It hurts too much to laugh and I'm too big to cry, you know." But Douglas had started something, you know. Those debates had started something. And the Republican Party grabbed hold of it. And it was going to be the eventual abolition of slavery. Now, folks, understand, I was never, and I repeat, I was never an abolitionist. No, as a matter of fact, I often said that abolitionists did more harm than they did good, you know, but I was always anti-slavery. If slavery wasn't wrong, then nothing was wrong. I can never remember a time that I didn't feel or think that way. So, I was nominated as a candidate for President of the United States. Now, that surprised me more than anybody, you know. No, I'm telling you, it did. Now, they had a convention, see, up in Chicago. And it was going to be such a big convention that they didn't have a building big enough to hold everybody. So they said, well, we'll just build one, and it was this big wooden structure. I don't know why they called it the wigwam. It didn't look anything like a wigwam, but that's what they called it. And it would hold 10,000 people. Now, I didn't go to the convention because in those days, you know, you didn't go to the convention if you were running for anything. So I stayed at home. As a matter of fact, the committee, the Republican committee, my friends, Judge David Davis and some others, Schultz and all those, they said, you know, Abe, this is what you're going to do. You're going to stay at home and keep your mouth shut. Kiss babies and shake hands, and we're going to get you elected president, you see. Because I had something that the other Republican candidates didn't have. I didn't have any enemies. I didn't have a lot of baggage, you see. And old David Davis is the one that told him, he said, you know, this rail splitter, this stump speaker from Illinois, he is a vote getter and a speech maker. And I believe we can get this boy elected, and when we do, we'll run this country just the way we want. I surprised him on that. But folks, long before I was ever even nominated for president, the clouds of disunion had been forming. Our nation had faced the threat of secession since before the ink was dry on the Declaration of Independence. President Washington faced the threat of secession during the Whiskey Rebellion. And not only was he willing to send troops into Pennsylvania, he said if he had to, he'd lead the army himself. Andrew Jackson acted just as boldly to crush the secession threat in 1832. And he too threatened to send federal troops into South Carolina and to hang every secessionist from the highest tree. And yet now, there are those who say that the latest secession threat is my fault. They say that they will not abide the election of a Republican president. They say if that happens, they'll destroy the Union. And then they say it will be my fault that the Union has been destroyed. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that's like having a robber come up to you with a pistol and saying, give me all your money or I'll kill you, and then you, sir, will be a murderer. You know, I don't think the states can separate. Physically, I don't think they can separate. I believe secession is unlawful. I believe that any nation that allows secession will disintegrate into anarchy, and more than anything, I believe that secession will destroy the world's only existing democracy. You know, I really want to know what the men of the South are going to do with their half of the Union. Are they going to split the Ohio River down the middle and push their half off a piece? Will they build up this impenetrable wall between us? Will they, once the Union has been dissolved, make war upon us and kill us all? Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that the men of the South are as brave and gallant as any men that live. And I know that they can fight nobly in a just cause. But man for man, they are not any better than we are. And there aren't as many of them as there are us. I don't think they're ever going to have much of a chance at whipping us. Some of the reasons they give for secession, they say that the federal government is refusing them the right to own slaves. That the federal government is trying to nullify the fugitive slave law. Oh, they say that the federal government is encouraging Negro equality, both socially and politically. And yet there's never been any threat of that. You know, I think the biggest reason for the secession threat among some of the Southern politicians is that with the Republican administration, the balance of political power in Washington, for which they themselves for more than 50 years have held the majority, will somehow slip away from them. But on November the 6th, 1860, after one of the dirtiest, meanest, rotten campaigns in the history of our nation, I, Abraham Lincoln, was elected in a constitutionally legal election as the 16th President of the United States. The first Republican to ever hold that position. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I was elected on November the 6th, but I would not be the president for more than 3 months. On December the 20th of 1860, South Carolina claimed she had left the Union. She was quickly followed by 6 other southern states. You see, they didn't wait to hear one word I had to say. They didn't wait to see anything I was going to do. No, they just did what they'd been planning on doing for more than 50 years. You know, the truth was, their candidate didn't get elected. Guess what? They were the minority, folks. They were the minority, and the minority says, if we don't get our man elected, then it's not a legal election. You know, the Democratic Party split itself in two anyhow. Douglas, the little giant, the Northern Democrats voted for him. They tried to have a convention, you know, in Washington, and it was a disaster. The Southern Democrats walked out. They said, no, we won't have anything to do with Douglas. And so they They nominated a candidate of their own, John C. Breckinridge. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you can't recall that name, John C. Breckinridge was the Vice President of the United States. And now, he was running in an election to split this country forever. And then, of course, you had John Bell of Tennessee running on the Union Constitutional Party. He just took votes away from everybody. I left my home in Springfield, headed for Washington, D.C. on February the 11th, day before my birthday. I wasn't going to make a farewell speech. I thought I'd made enough speeches, but when I got to the depot and when I stepped up on the platform of the rail car and I looked out and I saw the faces of so many of my neighbors, I had to say something. My friends, no one not in my situation can appreciate my feeling of sadness at this parting. To this place, to the kindness of these people, I owe everything. Here, I have lived for a quarter of a century, and I've passed from a young to an old man. Here, my children have been born, and one is buried. I now leave, not knowing when or whether ever I may return, with a task before me greater than that which rested upon Washington. Without the assistance of that divine being who ever attended him, I cannot succeed. With that assistance, I cannot fail. Trusting in him who can go with me and remain with you and be everywhere for good, let us confidently hope that all will yet be well. To his care commending you, as I hope in your prayers you will commend me, I bid you an affectionate farewell. Well, the train stopped at several large cities before we even got to Washington, and everyone wanted to know, what's your policy? What are you going to do? What are you going to do? I said, you know, I'm not the president. When I'm the president, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. Oh, I spoke a little of this and a little of that, but I skirted the issues, I admit. I skirted the issues, you know. But at one stop in the city of Westfield, New York, a little 11-year-old girl named Grace was brought up to the train to meet me. Now, ladies, you got to remember, I didn't always have this beard. You know, when I was running for president, I had a nice slick face. Mrs. Lincoln didn't like whiskers, said it tickled when I kissed her. But I got a letter from this little girl. It went something sort of like this, or at least this is what I perceived that she was saying. I thought what she was trying to say was, Mr. Lincoln, my papa says you're running for president. And he's shown me your picture, sir. And, well, sir, you'll forgive me for saying so, but your face is so long, and it's so skinny, and she just meant I was ugly. She meant I was ugly. She said more people would vote for me if I grow a beard. She said women like whiskers. And if I grow a beard, the women would tease their husbands to vote for me. She said if she was a boy and she could vote, if I grow whiskers, she'd vote for me. Well, they brought her up to the train to meet me. I picked her up, I kissed her right between the eyes, and I said, well, Gracie, what do you think of my new whiskers? She looked at me for a little bit, and then she said, well, Mr. Lincoln, it's a handsome effort. A handsome effort. And you know, ladies and gentlemen, those were some of the last kind words that anyone had for me for more than 4 long years. As I said, even before I took the oath of office, 7 of the states claimed they had left. In my first inaugural address, I begged them to change their minds and to come back home. I was willing to give them everything they asked for. I was willing to let them keep their slaves where they had slaves. I was willing, even though I thought it was the worst law that this nation had ever passed, I was willing to enforce the fugitive slave law. I was going to give them everything they wanted except the right to extend slavery to the new states and territories. And on that, I was not going to back up. I told them, I said, in your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without you yourselves being the aggressor. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy this government. For I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it. We're not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passions may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. But they wouldn't listen. They didn't really want to listen. Ladies and gentlemen, the first letter I received as President of the United States was from Major Robert Anderson, commander of the Federal Forces at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. He informed me that he was surrounded by hostile forces, and unless help arrived by April the 15th, that he would be out of supplies and he would have no other choice but to surrender the fort. I was faced with three difficult decisions. I could send food along with reinforcements to the fort, which I knew would initiate hostilities. I could surrender the fort, which would be in direct violation of the oath I took as president, or I could choose to send supplies only. I chose to send supplies. I sent a letter to Anderson and I told him, I said, hold out. Hold out as long as you can. We're going to send a relief. We're going to send supplies, but under no circumstances put you or your men at any unnecessary risk. I sent that letter by our courier to Charleston Harbor. General Beauregard, commanding the Confederate forces, so they called themselves, refused to let the letter go to Anderson, but he knew what was in the letter. He knew that Anderson was going to have to walk out of that fort on April the 15th. Tell me why. Tell me why they fired on the fort on April the 12th. And then they said that I coerced them into doing it. But the war started. As far as I was concerned, the first thing I did was issued a blockade order for the southern ports. Now, some people said that I was declaring war. No, I wasn't declaring war. I was trying to keep these rebellious states, as I thought, from getting supplies from their European suppliers. And you know what? It worked. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. Oh, I did something else, too. I called for 75,000 volunteers. One fellow said, Lincoln, what makes you think that you can call for 75,000 volunteers to invade the South without the authorization of Congress? Well, you know, folks, South Carolina knew exactly what she was doing when she fired on Fort Sumter. Congress wasn't even in session. It wasn't like they could jump on their horse and be back in Washington the next day. The city of Washington, the District of Columbia, was surrounded by secessionists. You know, I didn't call for 75,000 volunteers to invade the South. I called for 75,000 volunteers to put down insurrection. I did a few other little things too, you know. Oh, I get this one all the time. Well, you suspended the writ of habeas corpus. You can't do that. That's unconstitutional, you know. Well, again, what was I supposed to do? Was I supposed to let all of these spies, these terrorists to some extent, these deserters from the nation, was I supposed to leave them alone all over Washington? No. So I suspended the writ of habeas corpus. Well, is it legal? Well, according to the Constitution it is. Article 1, Section 9, Paragraph 3, it states, and it says, by the way, the privilege. It doesn't say the right. It says the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended. And they said, see there? I said, wait a minute, there's not a period there. You're always putting a period there. There's a comma there. It says the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless in times of invasion or rebellion the public safety is at risk. Well, the public safety was at risk. And ladies and gentlemen, I was the Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States, and I was willing to take whatever measures necessary to preserve this Union as a whole, and if it was unconstitutional, then I would answer for the consequences. You know, I told a fellow one time, I said, you know, he says, you're just trampling all over the Constitution. I said, well, you know, I said, sometimes a surgeon finds it necessary to amputate a limb in order to save a life. but he will never give up a life in order to save a limb. And if I have to damage a part of that document to save the whole, I'm prepared to do it and answer for the consequences. Oh, they say that me, personally, arrested over 13,000 political prisoners. Poppycock. Most of those arrests, if you'll go to the record, most of those arrests were in the state of Missouri. Were they political prisoners? No. They were arsonists. They were bridge burners. You know, they were guerrillas. You know, I guess one of the most famous cases for the writ of habeas corpus, there was this fella in Ohio. You know, Clement Vallandigham. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. I never could. He was an Ohio Democrat who was against the war entirely. Now, he claimed to be an abolitionist of sorts, but anyhow, he was going to give the South anything they wanted. And Clement was not only encouraging young men to desert from the Army, but he would go to recruiting stations and make speeches telling these boys why it was not only against the Constitution, but against God's law for them to go to war, you know. I did not have that man arrested. But General Ambrose Burnside did have him arrested. I didn't know anything about it until after he was arrested. But of course, the papers all, Lincoln's, he's arrested Clement. And then when Judge Taney, by the way, Judge Taney is the Supreme Court judge that handed down the worst decision the Supreme Court has ever made, the Dred Scott decision. The Dred Scott decision said that a black man could never, ever be a citizen in the United States of America. Never. Taney was, I know it went against Taney to have to swear me in as the President of the United States. But Taney had issued a writ of habeas corpus for Mr. Vallandigham. And I just told my boys, just ignore it. You know. By the way, it was not a unanimous Supreme Court decision either. It was Judge Taney's decision. But finally, I saw that to keep Mr. Clement Vallandigham in prison was going to do more harm than it did good, so I came up with a plan. I said, turn him loose, send him south. They got all the secessionists, they need one more down there, send him south, you know. Well, they sent him south, and they didn't want him. So somehow he managed to make his way to Canada, and he stayed up there, almost to the elections of 1864, and by that time, he really wasn't a problem anymore. They said, well, if he comes back, he's going to start this. I said, if he comes back, just let him talk. But ladies and gentlemen, in the beginning of the war, my soldiers were losing one battle after another. Thousands and thousands of young boys were dying on the battlefields. And it was in February of 1862 that my wife Mary and I suffered another personal loss. You see, our third-born son, William, our dear little Willie, he died of a fever while we were living in the White House. It was almost more than I could stand. His mother, God bless her, she never really did get over it. More than a month went by, and Mary was still sitting in her room looking aimlessly out the window. I went in one morning and I put my hand on her shoulder. And I said, Mary, I know it was hard to have our little Willie die. I guess he was just too good for this earth, and that's why God called him home. But Mother, you have 2 more boys to care for, and I have a job to do, and we must both of us get better. Mary, do you see out the window yonder? Do you see that white building? Honey, that's the insane asylum. If you don't get better, I might have to put you there. The war got a little better. Mary got a little better, but the war didn't. And Mary and I certainly were not the only parents that lost a son. Families both north and south were suffering tremendous losses. Why, on the 6th and 7th of April, near Shiloh Church in Tennessee, 2 days of fighting left a carpet of bloody casualties. More than 10,000 soldiers were dead, and almost that many were missing and wounded. And among the dead at Shiloh was my wife's half-brother, Samuel B. Todd. And ladies and gentlemen, Sam was in the Southern Army. My wife would lose 2 other half-brothers and a brother-in-law, all fighting for the Confederacy. The people in the South said my wife was a spy for the North. The people in the North said my wife was a spy for the South. Ladies, can you understand why Mary had emotional problems? But several months after Shiloh, on September the 17th, 1862, a place called Antietam would forever be known as the bloodiest single day in the history of America. There were 23,000 soldiers killed, wounded, and missing in one day. And my general claimed that we won the battle. We did not win. At best, it was a tie. But I used it as a victory, and I used it as an excuse to do something I'd been planning for more than a year. On the 22nd day of September, I called the members of my cabinet together, and I said, "Gentlemen, for some time now, I've given a great deal of thought to the relationship of this war to slavery. Now, you'll recall several months ago, I read you an order I prepared on that subject, but because of objections from some of you, that order was never issued. Ever since then, my mind has been very occupied with this subject, so I determined that as soon as a rebel army should be driven out of Maryland, that I would issue a proclamation of emancipation." Now, I said nothing to no one, but I made a promise. I made a promise to myself, and I made a promise to my Maker. Well, gentlemen, the rebel army's been driven out. I intend to fulfill that promise. I've called you here today to see what I've written. I do not, however, seek your advice or your opinion on this matter. What I've done after careful and prayerful deliberation and meditation, and I can only trust in God that I haven't made a mistake. With that, I pen my name to the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. And it declared that as of January the 1st, 1863, that all persons held as slaves in states that were in rebellion against the Union would be forever free. But ladies and gentlemen, that certainly didn't free all the slaves. You see, we had slaves in the border states, Delaware, Maryland, Missouri. Oh, and in the very place where I was born, in the state of Kentucky, there were 250,000 souls in bondage. They were going to have to wait 2 more years for the passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution to get their freedom. If that sounds confusing to you, put yourself in the place of one of those Kentucky slaves, or better yet, a Tennessee slave. You see, it didn't free any of them either. But they'd all heard about it. They were ready to throw off their chains and celebrate, only to have someone come up and say, no, you see, it's those slaves down there. They're free, not you. But ladies and gentlemen, if that piece of paper didn't do anything else, it spelled the beginning of the end for the war. And it made it possible for nearly 200,000 black soldiers to join my army. And in the remainder of the war, those black soldiers would participate in more than 449 separate engagements. Nearly 40,000 of those black soldiers died wearing a blue uniform. Oh, and by the way, 24 of those brave black soldiers and sailors received our nation's highest award, the Medal of Honor. Make no mistake, if we hadn't had the help of those black soldiers, I think the war could have gone on indefinitely. And you know, even with their help, it did go on. But I signed it on January the 1st, 1863. I signed it. I'd been downstairs shaking hands all morning, and when I got up to the office to sign it, I picked up my pen, I dipped it in the ink, and as I began to touch it to the paper, my hand began to tremble uncontrollably. I laid it down, I backed away from the table, I looked at my cabinet and I said, "Gentlemen, if my name is ever going to go down in history for any document, I believe it's this one. If my hand shakes, the people will think I had doubts." I took a breath, took up the pen again, signed my full name, Abraham Lincoln. If you look at it, it's still a little shaky, you know. But ladies and gentlemen, by March of 1863, it had become apparent to myself and a lot of people in the nation that if this country was going to be saved, it was going to have some type of divine intervention. Oh, I had signed many proclamations like other presidents calling for national days of prayer and thanksgiving and fasting. But on March the 30th, 1863, I signed my name to this proclamation. And it said, "It is the duty of nations, as well as of men, to owe their dependence upon the overruling power of God, to confess their sins and transgressions in humble sorrow, yet with assured hope that genuine repentance will lead to mercy and pardon, and to recognize the sublime truth announced in Holy Scriptures and proven by all history that those nations only are blessed whose God is the Lord. And insomuch as we know that nations, like individuals, are subjected to punishments and chastisements in this world, may we not justly fear that the terrible calamity which now desolates our great land is but a punishment inflicted upon us for the presumption of our national sins? We have been the recipients of the choicest bounties of heaven. We have been preserved these many years in peace and prosperity. We have grown in numbers, wealth, and power as no other nation has ever grown. But we have forgotten God. We have forgotten the gracious hand that preserved us in peace, multiplied, enriched, and strengthened us. And we have vainly imagined, in the deceitfulness of our own hearts, that all of these many blessings were produced by some superior wisdom and virtue of our own. Intoxicated with unbroken success, we have become too self-sufficient to feel the necessity of a redeeming and preserving grace. Too proud to pray to the God that made us. It behooves us then to humble ourselves before the offended power, to pray for clemency and forgiveness. And when this is done in sincerity and truth, let us rest in the hope authorized in divine teachings that the united cry of the nation will be heard on high and answered with blessings no less than the pardon of our national sins and the restoration of our now suffering and divided country to its normal happy condition of unity and peace. And yet, the war went on. And on the first 3 days of July, in the year 1863, in and around a small Pennsylvania town called Gettysburg, was fought the bloodiest battle ever to take place on the North American continent. Over 50,000 American lives vanished into the mist and smoke and flame of a human storm. Several months later, I was in Gettysburg. I'd been invited by the governor of Pennsylvania to make a few appropriate remarks at the dedication of a cemetery where some of my soldiers were buried. Now, friends, understand, they didn't really want me to come to Gettysburg, but they had to invite me. I was the president. But I wasn't the main speaker. No, they gave that honor to someone else. The man's name was Edward Everett. He was the most famous orator of our day. Mr. Everett stood on the platform that morning. He addressed the crowd for more than 2 hours. It was a fine speech. I spoke to the people that day a little less than 3 minutes. And this is what I said. Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now, we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate. We cannot consecrate. We cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggle here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It's rather that we be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, and that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. But ladies and gentlemen, the war went on. As a matter of fact, it got worse. And in 1864, or late 1863, I decided that I would run for another term in office. I'll be honest with you, friends. I would have rather given it to someone else. But I couldn't comprehend handing another man the disaster that our country was in. Now, if I was such a dictator and a constitutional usurper, why would I have allowed an election to be held anyhow? I'll be honest with you. I didn't think I had any chance of winning that election. I was so convinced of that and one day I called the members of my cabinet together. I slid a little piece of paper across the table. It was blank, you know. And I said, gentlemen, I've called you here today for a reason. I put an inscription on the opposite side of this paper. What I ask of each and one of you now is to sign this document sight unseen and give me your word that you will abide what I have written. To my surprise, every member of my cabinet signed it, sight unseen. I stuck it in my pocket, and the elections went on. But things changed. I finally put Ulysses S. Grant in command of the entire Army, and things began to change. People thought the war was bad. Sherman, Grant, and Sheridan taught the entire world what warfare was all about. Grant took Atlanta, went through the South. I was elected. I was the first president since Andrew Jackson to be elected to a second term in office. And there are some people still to this day that claim that my second inaugural address sounded more like a preacher than a president. You'll have to make up your mind. This is part of what I said on that day. My countrymen, on the occasion corresponding to this 4 years ago, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All dreaded it. All sought to divert it. Both sides deprecated war, yet one side would make war rather than see the Union preserved, and the other side would accept war rather than see the Union perish, and the war came. Both sides read the same Bible. Both sides prayed to the same God, and each invoked his aid against the other. The prayers of both could not be answered, and the prayers of neither have been answered fully. Fondly do we hope. Fervently do we pray that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it should continue, until all the wealth piled up by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn by the lash shall be repaid by another drawn by the sword, as it was said 3,000 years ago, so still must it be said today, that the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether, with malice toward none, with charity to all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work that we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. And finally, April the 9th, 1865, after more than 623,000 Americans had died, General Robert E. Lee and his army surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, and for all intent and purposes, the war was over. But now, ladies and gentlemen, as the president, I had another difficult task to perform. You see, now I had to rebuild an entire nation that had been torn in two and shattered to pieces. But it was a task that I would never finish. Just 5 days after Lee's surrender, just 5 days after what everyone prayed was the end of the war, on Good Friday, April the 14th, 1865, my wife Mary and I went to Ford's Theater in Washington to attend a play entitled Our American Cousin. About halfway through that play, just as I had reached to take my wife by the hand, an angry young man named John Wilkes Booth pointed a small gun just behind my left ear, and he fired one shot. I became the first American president to be assassinated. You know, ladies and gentlemen, I was only 56 years old. I did it. I told you the whole story of my life, from the day I was born till the day I died. But more important, I told you a little something about my war, that terrible Civil War. Now, if you'll bear with me for just a moment, I need desperately to talk to you about a different kind of war. And that's the great many wars that these children are fighting every day. The wars against hunger, poverty, and racism. The wars against crime, drugs, and violence. The wars against diseases. Friends, my war, and every war since then, has been fought, won, and lost with too many guns, too much blood, and way too many human lives. Ladies and gentlemen, the wars that these children are fighting can only truly be won with two things: a loving and merciful God and knowledge. The knowledge that even now might be locked deep within the mind of a young child, and to unlock that knowledge, they need a key. That key is education. Step up here, sweetie. Tell me your name again.
Hannah.
Hannah. Hannah. Do you know, when I was living in New Salem, Illinois, my best friend was a fellow named Jack Armstrong. Jack got married to the prettiest girl in town, and her name was Hannah. Hannah Armstrong. Well, guess what, folks? If little Hannah here would just stay in school and study real hard, she could someday find a way to end world hunger, poverty, and racism. Thank you, Hannah. Hannah, come here, buddy. He just got off the soccer field. What's your name again?
James.
James. Now, if James would just stay in school and study real hard, he could someday find a way to end these wars against crime, drugs, and violence. Thank you, James. What's your name again?
Coleman.
Look here at him. Now, you might not think to look at him right now, but I'll tell you what. If he'll just stay in school and study real hard, this little fella could be the one person on this planet to find a cure for cancer, AIDS, leukemia, diabetes, just to name a few. Thank you there, bud. And this is Mary. Oh, Mary. Like my sweet Mary. Well, guess what? If this little Mary will just stay in school and study real hard, there's not a power on this earth that can stop this little girl from growing up and being the President of the United States. Because, understand, ladies and gentlemen, in her lifetime, there's going to be a woman president. Already in her lifetime, we've elected our first African-American president. Ladies and gentlemen, whether you like it or not, change is coming. So get ready, because in her lifetime, there will be an Asian president, a Hispanic president, and I hope and pray, a Native American president. It could be a child that you know. It could be your child. So you see, ladies and gentlemen, as much as I enjoy coming out here and sharing this with you, that's not the reason I'm here. I come to these events to beg every adult within the sound of my voice to encourage every child they see, whether they're yours or not, to stay in school, to educate themselves, and then challenge these young people to go out into that big old world and do something good to help their fellow man. Ladies and gentlemen, I stand up here this evening. I represent nothing more than an image and a voice from the past. These children, your children, are the voices of tomorrow. And it's into their young and your capable hands that I leave the future of the entire world. With that, ladies and gentlemen, I bid all of you an affectionate farewell. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so very much. You humble me. I know I got a little long in the tooth and went a little longer than I should have. But I always give every audience I speak to the opportunity to ask the President any questions they might have of anything within reason. It gets a little, when I'm with an exhibit like this, it can get a little scary sometimes, but you know, I'll entertain. Yes, sir.
Now, the 13th Amendment
yes.
was passed shortly after your death, like a year or two?
No, no, no. The 13th Amendment was ratified in December of 1865.
Okay.
Now,
did you have any influence on that happening?
Oh, yeah, I did. As a matter of fact, the day I signed the Emancipation Proclamation, when I signed it, when I stood up and walked away from the table, I went back and I said, gentlemen, I can do this now because the war powers gives me that authority. I said, but when this war is over, this document will not hold up because in peacetime, it will be unconstitutional. So I began to advocate for something that I was always against. I was always against amending our Constitution. Our founding fathers made it perfect. And I thought if we start amending it, where will we stop? But I said slavery, if we don't have an amendment to end slavery, then it's all been for nothing. I did something that no other president has ever done before or since. I actually signed my signature to the 13th Amendment. Now, I had no legal right to do that, but to be honest with you, I just wanted to be a part of it. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
When your mother died,
Mm-hmm.
why didn't the cows die when they...
Why didn't the cows die when my mama died? Well, you know, honey, some of the cows did. They got what they called the trembles, but for a long time, people didn't know what was making everyone sick. The reason my mother died is because she had gone to her sister and her brother-in-law's house. They had the trembles. While she was taking care of them, she drank the milk from their cow. They died. She came back home. A short time later, she began to get the trembles, and she died. That plant still grows in Indiana and all parts of the country. It's called white snake root. Cows still eat it today, but you know, the process the milk goes through, it's safe. It's safe for you to drink the milk today. But thank you. That was a great question. Anything else? Now, don't be bashful. Yes, sir.
The paper you had everybody sign.
Yes. Oh! Oh, I didn't tell you what the paper said. Yeah, well, I didn't. I thought, I'm sorry. Yeah, they signed it. I told them, and you said, sign it. And so after the election, they said, well, you know, what did we sign? You know. So I read it to them. I took it out of my pocket, and I read, and it says, and I'll try to quote it verbatim, for quite some time, it has been apparent that the present administration will not be elected. And when that time comes, it will be the duty of this administrator to do all in his power to save the Union, as an incoming administrator will have no way of doing it. So, you know, yeah. I didn't want somebody else to have to take that over. Anything else? Yes, sir.
This isn't having to do with history
All
or
right.
anything else, but I've been to New Salem,
Mm-hmm.
and I've been to your house in Springfield,
Mm-hmm.
and I saw the bed that you slept in. How did you ever sleep in that bed? Because that bed was so small compared to your size.
You talking about the one in Springfield or the one in New Salem?
In Springfield.
Well, you know, I tell you what, you look at that bed. By the way, Mrs. Lincoln and I had separate bedrooms, which was normal in those days. It's, you know, I could sleep catty corner, you know. It's a lot better than the first place I lived in Springfield. I moved to Springfield, Illinois. I had the clothes on my back, a couple of law books, a change of underwear, and my saddlebags. And I went into the general store there, and Joshua Speed was a friend of mine, and he said, well, Lincoln, what brings you to Springfield? I said, I've come to try my hand at the law. And I said, I need the makings of a bed. If I'm successful in my venture, you'll get your money for it. If I'm not successful, you'll probably never get your money. And he said, well, Lincoln, I have a large room upstairs with a double bed in it. You're more than welcome to share it with me. I went upstairs, threw my saddlebags on the bed, came back downstairs, and I said, well, Speed have moved. I think he meant for me to only stay 2 weeks, you know, at the most. I stayed 4 years, so be careful about who you invite to spend the night. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned that you didn't always approve of the tactics of the abolitionists. Could you talk a little bit about your relationship with the abolitionists, particularly Frederick Douglass?
Now, okay, what I disagreed with abolitionists is they were for freedom at any cost, no matter what, you know. That was too much, you know. If it meant, and I had said, if I can save the nation without freeing any slave, I'll do it. If I can save the nation, free part of them and leave part of them in bondage, I'll do that. If I can save the nation by freeing them all, I'll do that. I said, what I do because it helps me preserve the Union. That was my paramount. But you see, I met Frederick Douglass. As a matter of fact, Frederick Douglass was the first black man ever to see the President of the United States alone. And I invited him. Boy, whew, if I'd only known. I invited him to come talk to me, and he did, and he was loaded for bear. You know, we had these black soldiers in the Army. They weren't getting equal pay. They weren't getting promoted. And, and Jeff Davis had signed a document that they would execute any slaves they found in a Union uniform or put them in prison. And so he was mad. He was madder than a wet wasp, you know. And he came in the door, and he came in, and I stood up, and I extended my hand, and he started to say, Mr. Douglass, my name is Frederick. And I said, I know who you are, Mr. Douglass. Mr. Seward has told me all about you. And I knew a lot about Douglass. We had this conversation, he and I, and we developed a very, very strong friendship. Once he gave all of his points to me as to why I was slow doing this, and, you know, and he couldn't understand. You know, we want it right now. But as each of his points, as I explained that to him, when Douglass left, if you read his own narrative, he said, although I still do not agree with everything the President does, I am beginning to see his motives. I'm beginning to see where he's going. It took time. Frederick Douglass and myself became, I'm not going to say we were the best of friends, but we met 3 times in the White House. And we were going to meet one time in the soldiers' cottage. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. I invited him. Not only did I invite him to come and hear my second inaugural address, I invited him to come to the reception afterwards. And he did exactly what I invited him to do. He came and he heard the speech. He showed up at the front door of the White House in his finest frock coat. They wouldn't let him in. He was black. He said, no, 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 this won't do, this won't do. So there's a little struggle. He did get in, but no sooner had he got in the door that some men were trying to put him out the window. And finally, another congressman friend of mine saw this and says, no, 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 let him in, let him in. And Frederick, if you will read, again, if you will read his narrative, he says, and I walked into the East Room, and he says, and there, a head above everyone else in the room, was the President. And he said in a very loud voice, well, there's my friend Douglass. And the crowd, like the Red Sea, parted. Douglass came up to me. I shook his hand, and I said, Mr. Douglass, I saw your face in the crowd today when I was delivering my speech. And, sir, I can think of no person whose opinion I would rather hear. Douglass tried not to answer. He says, there's just too many people. We don't have time. I said, no, no, I want to know. And he still had me by the hand, and he looked up, and he said, Mr. Lincoln, it was a sacred effort. So he liked it. He liked it. He also, on that inaugural day, followed up my carriage as long as he could on foot. If you will read his narrative, he said, I wanted somehow to be close to him. He said, because I really thought that his end was coming soon. He had a premonition that I wouldn't be there. Yes?
What about that? What about that in regards to the dreams that you had regarding your death?
Well, you know, they make a lot to do out of that. You know, everybody has dreams. We're not responsible for what we dream. You know, we're really not. And I had one about, you know, and I had told some people about it, and then we were having this little thing in the White House, and one of them said, well, what about this dream you had? What about this dream you had? And Mary, she didn't like dreams. Oh, Father, no, no, no. Well, they convinced me to tell them this dream, you know, so I recited the dream for them. And yeah, I'd had a dream about 10 days, you know, before that, and I was asleep, you know, and I heard, I'm not going to quote it verbatim, even though I can, because we don't have time. I heard weeping. I woke up and thought I heard weeping, and in this dream I wandered downstairs in my nightshirt, which was a long yellow nightshirt, believe it or not, bright yellow, and these little flop shoes that I wore. And I wandered down there with a lamp, and the same moans and cries everywhere just seemed to follow me, but there was nobody there. And I recognized everything in the room. There was light in all the rooms. Then I walked into the East Room, And there I met with a sickening surprise, because before me was a catafalque, which rested a corpse whose face was covered. And there was a great throng of people around the corpse, gazing mournfully, some weeping openly. There were soldiers standing around the corpse, acting as guards. And in this dream, I walked up to one of the soldiers and I demanded, I said, "Who is dead in the White House?" The soldier turned and he said, "The president. He was killed by an assassin." And then there was this loud cry of grief, and that awoke me from my dream, you know. And although it was just a dream, you know, I have to admit, it bothered me. Yeah, it bothered me. Yes, sir.
You chose a Tennessean for your second running mate,
Yeah.
Andrew Johnson.
Mm-hmm.
Have any regrets about that?
Well, first of all, I didn't choose him. You know, I have to tell you, Hannibal Hamlin was my first vice president. Hannibal Hamlin was from the state of Maine, and that's where he spent most of his 4 years, was in Maine. Yeah, you have to understand, really and truly, the office of the vice president was pretty much, you know, yeah, it was kind of a, well, we need one, so we'll have one, you know. So here it is, the election of 1864, and there's several people that their names are brought up as a vice presidential running mate, and the committee, they come to me and they said, "You know, we're thinking about Governor Andrew Johnson of Tennessee." And I thought for a while, and I thought, well, you know, why not? He's from the South. He's a Democrat, you know. Now, I don't think that's ever happened since, you know, a Republican president and a Democratic vice president. Johnson was elected as vice president. Again, I didn't choose him, but I certainly thought it's a pretty good idea. We only spoke 4 times from the day he took the oath of office till I was assassinated. We didn't have much time to spend together, unfortunately. Yes, sir.
How long did it take you to write the Gettysburg Address?
How long did it take me to write the Gettysburg Address? Well, first of all, I did not write the Gettysburg Address on the back of an envelope on the train on the way to Gettysburg. That's a great story, and it's in a lot of children's books, too. I mean, it's in print that Lincoln wrote the Gettysburg Address on the back of an envelope. Guess how that story started? In the late 1890s or the early 1900s, there was a stationery company out of New York, and they printed the Gettysburg Address on the back of one of their envelopes, and it was a hot seller, and it's been selling ever since. I spent 2 weeks writing the Gettysburg Address. I only received my invitation. I'm thinking, on the 7th of November, and I was supposed to speak on the 17th of November, and I took great pains to write that speech over and over and over and over again. It only has 10 sentences. And even when I got to Gettysburg the night before, when I was upstairs, I asked my personal valet, William Johnson, which, by the way, when we finished, if you like, ask me who William Johnson was. He was a Haitian. He was my personal valet, and he was a fine, fine man. I sent him downstairs to get some stationery. I was dissatisfied with something on the second page, and I changed it even then. And even when I spoke it, the written copy of my speech did not have the phrase "under God" written in it. But I wrote 5 handwritten copies of the Gettysburg Address. No 2 of them are alike. The reason I did it is because shortly after I got back to Washington, Edward Everett wrote me a letter. And he said, "Mr. President, sir, I would flatter myself if I had been able to come as close to the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes. And at your convenience, I would deem it an honor if you would give me a copy of your speech." So I wrote 5 copies. For many years, we only knew the existence of 4. The 5th one finally showed up in Cuba. It had been bought at auction by a wealthy plantation owner down there decades before, and in his will, he gave it back to the American people. I don't know if it's still there now, but that used to be the copy that they had on display in the so-called Lincoln bedroom. So, yeah. Good question. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for coming out. I want to thank this library for having this. It's a great exhibit. It's traveling all over the country, and I've had the privilege of working with it at several libraries and universities across the country. Have a great trip home. Everyone be safe. Boys and girls, stay in school. Ladies and gentlemen, vote. I don't care who you vote for. Vote. Here's the most wonderful thing about this country that we live in. If you don't like the way it's going, every 4 years you get a chance to change it. They can't do that other places in the world. Thank you very much. Have a great evening.